Thank you all for paying attention.
You're the master of ceremony.
Welcome to the FreeManCast.
All right, welcome everybody. This is the Friedman podcast with Brent Sanders and Josh Friedman.
Yeah, I am Josh Friedman. I think we're live on the Josh Friedman Facebook profile.
I heard you just came back from some sort of Western Balkan trip.
I did. I got back this morning from Belgrade. I was on an overnight bus last night. The night before, I was on an overnight bus. The night before, I was not on an overnight bus, but the night before that, I was on an overnight bus. So I've spent three of the last 4 nights sleeping on buses. Yes.
3 out of the last 4 nights without even 3 out of the last 4 nights without even giving an introduction to the people. Your turn.
An introduction to whom? About what?
Whoever's listening. Is anybody there?
Nazir, thank you for joining. Vasco,
Hello.
thank you for joining.
Hey, Vasco.
We're starting, I guess, a little late in the evening, Eastern Balkan time. I guess it is 10:15 p.m. Western Balkan time. This is unannounced. It's a bit of an impromptu Facebook Live. And Brent, you are the anchor here, so why don't you take charge?
I want to know what's going through your mind, Josh. You've been on several travels around the Balkans and Europe and outside of Europe. Josh,
apologies, Vasco. Next time I will certainly remember you.
But I suppose that each time the travels have changed, yes? I mean, first time it was immigration, now?
Okay, first, can we just get a little confirmation from whoever's... No, that was my fault. I forgot. That was my fault, Vasco. I apologize. Sujuyavam. But can someone just confirm whether our audio is all right? Can you hear us? Just please let us know in the comments whether you can hear us all right or whether we need to be a little louder. Thank you. So your question, so Brent, you were asking about how I first went to the Western Balkans to cover immigration, and now it's changed up a bit.
It's sort of a twofold question. First, I want to know how have the Western...
Thank you, Vasco, regarding the audio. Thank you.
Thank you. How have the Western Balkans changed since you were first there a few years ago? 4?
3.5, something.
I'll save the second question for a moment from now.
Okay, well, that's an interesting point you raised, because you joined me on at least one of those Western Balkan trips a couple of years back when it was still the thick of the migrant crisis here in Europe. And indeed, back then, when there were hundreds of thousands of migrants and refugees pouring across the Western Balkans on the way to Central, Western, and Northern Europe, that was the key issue in the region. That was the core issue. That's what everyone was talking about, and there was no way of avoiding it, at least if you were in Macedonia or Serbia, and to a lesser extent some other countries. But since there was the migrant deal struck between the EU and Turkey, the migrant and refugee situation in the region has definitely slowed down significantly. And if we fast forward to now, I would say the major geopolitical issue in the region is the region's integration or lack thereof into the European Union and NATO. So the migrant crisis is still ongoing. In fact, it even factors into this Western integration process, but it's not really at the forefront right now.
That brings up a completely different question that I hadn't really considered until just now. But to what extent is a candidate country into the EU, to what extent is their ability to deal with the migrant crisis or to accept migrants factored into their ability or their qualification to join the EU?
Okay, so let's take a step back before answering this. Right now, there are basically 7 countries that are technically trying to join the EU. 6 are in the Western Balkans, and the 7th is Turkey. And each of those countries factor into this migrant crisis, albeit there are only a few that are really been heavily involved in the Western Balkans. Turkey is still a candidate country that it's in negotiations about joining the European Union. However, realistically, no one believes right now that Turkey is joining the EU, and the EU is, in a sense, pretending that the process is still going on, that Turkey's still trying to join the EU, but because of the situation there with a lot of the crackdown on civil liberties and some of the repression that's been happening there, Turkey, and because of sour relations between Turkey and the EU, Turkey's basically not joining the EU, at least not any time in the near future. However, Turkey is the key country for the EU in dealing with the refugee crisis and the migrant flows. So arguably, the EU is dragging Turkey along. Brussels is arguably dragging Turkey along through this accession process, even though it doesn't intend to have Turkey welcomed in as a member. They're arguably continuing that process because they believe that they need to be working closely with Turkey to manage the migrant flows. Now, on the Western Balkan countries, the EU has said, in general, as well as in its progress reports, that it's very satisfied with how Serbia and Macedonia and others responded to the migrant crisis. And I think that did give these countries in the Western Balkans better standing with the EU and could possibly lift up their case for joining the EU more than had things not worked out so well in terms of the EU and the Western Balkans cooperating on the migrant issue. But in order for these countries to join the EU, they're going to have to meet all kinds of democratic criteria, and merely cooperating on the migrant issue is not enough.
Well, in that case, then we have to
By
ask
the way,
you,
Brent, you're like half in the screen, half not.
I'm not used to this.
And by the way,
We are live.
thank you for joining us. And if you do have questions, please, or comments, please chime in. The EU, Vasco says the EU is paying Turkey to hold the migrants wave. It is not connected with the path of Turkey to the EU. I think we just answered that, addressed that. So what was your
Well,
question?
my next question is much more personal, Josh, and you have to look me in the eyes for that. It's, how do you feel differently? I mean, how have you changed as a reporter after how many years? 4 years? 4 years.
You mean out here in the Balkans?
In Europe, traveling around?
3.5.
Have your political views changed at all, or does the evidence seem to confirm your beliefs?
Okay, now we're sliding a little bit away from what's going on right now in the Western Balkans. Anyway, okay, so I showed up. I showed up in Europe with my personal politics being libertarian, and 3.5 years later, my personal politics are libertarian.
What does that mean for the Western Balkans?
I'm not advocating what these countries do with their domestic politics or their foreign policy. When I'm in these countries, I'm learning what's going on. I'm meeting with sources. I'm watching demonstrations. I'm conducting interviews, and I'm producing reports on the region. I don't go there to advocate what Serbia should do with its geopolitical leanings or whether Macedonia should join NATO. I'm not there advocating any of this stuff. I'm there learning and reporting. Hold on, we have a long comment from Nazir at the moment.
I think that your viewers can agree with your assessment of your own abilities and your own behavior. My question is,
Here's Vasco asks a follow. I guess Vasco is anchoring this as much as
Let's
Brent
go,
is.
Vasco.
Why don't you're the anchor. Why don't you
Okay.
read?
Josh, did you find many libertarians in the Balkans? And also, do you feel that there is more in one specific country or not? Which, if yes. So, where are there more libertarians in the Balkans? Are there libertarians here?
Well, Vasco, we were just at a libertarian conference in Serbia, and a lot of libertarians showed up there, many of whom were coming from other regions within Europe. But I have really been surprised by particularly the number of libertarians I found and the organization of libertarians, particularly in Bulgaria and Serbia. Now, granted, I've been to some events and conferences with them, whereas I haven't been to other libertarian events or gatherings elsewhere in the Balkans, but I've met plenty of people there. So yeah, when I came out here, I was actually very surprised by the number of libertarians who are out here and how organized they are.
So, thank you, Vasco, for that question. Josh, if you applying your libertarian philosophy, I have a question for you because I've lived here in the Balkans for many years. And I think about probably 15, 20 years ago, I was saying the Balkans would be so much better than joining the EU if they just had their own regional treaty amongst themselves where they get along, where they trade. Do you think that that's feasible? And if not, why?
I was actually having a very similar discussion pretty much about this issue yesterday with someone in Belgrade. And this was not exactly the point of this broadcast or the point of my trip or
here,
whatnot.
Josh. It's not your fault.
But I do believe that if the Balkan countries were to come to the conclusion that this EU integration process is going nowhere or is going to take so long that there's just so little point in following through with it, and they were to embark upon some economic freedom zone or free trade zone in the Balkans, I do believe that could end up with creating some prosperity in the region. Granted, this is all quite hypothetical.
So why hasn't it happened? What's stopping the process? Is it the EU, or is it America? Is it Russia? Is it Turkey?
I mean, these are all players in the region, and as of late, I would argue that the West has been taking more interest in the Balkans, and particularly the Western Balkans, because of some of the geopolitical tug-of-wars that have been happening. Russia has been trying to exert some influence in the region. Turkey, ever since the 90s and the wars and with the breakup of Yugoslavia, has been playing a diplomatic role in the region. So I do see that the West, particularly the EU and NATO, and to a lesser extent the US, is pressuring certain leaders, pretty much all the major leaders in the Western Balkans right now, to go on the Euro-Atlantic course, to follow the steps that are required for these countries to join the EU and NATO. And a bunch of them, actually, some of them have already joined NATO, and at least one of them is also pretty close to joining NATO. And every country in the region now is currently trying to join the EU. If you look at the polls, in most of these places there's a pretty strong sentiment in favor of joining the EU, if not outright majorities, particularly in the Albanian regions. In the Albanian regions, they're very pro-EU, very pro-NATO. So I'm talking about Albania proper, Kosovo, the Albanian regions, and Macedonia and Montenegro and whatnot. ethnic Serb populations in the Western Balkans are not as pro-EU, definitely not as pro-NATO, but still the region as a whole, if you look at their trade patterns, where they travel, where they study, where they go get jobs, they're much more connected economically to Europe than they are to any of these other powers that might be exerting influence in the region. So for several years now, it's been the clear strategic course for a variety of reasons for these countries to angle themselves toward the EU and NATO.
Okay, so you were just in 2 of the 6 potential candidate countries. Montenegro.
It gets very confusing when you use the specific EU terms about which country is a candidate and which country is a potential candidate and whatnot. Right now, that's an interesting question. Right now, there are 6 countries in the Western Balkans that are trying to join the EU. Not all are trying to join NATO. It's a little more confusing about that. But every country in the region is either currently in the EU or is trying to join the EU. And of those 6 that are currently trying to join the EU, I was in 4 of them last week.
Okay, answer Vasco's question.
All right, Vasco asked Josh, did you feel in any way any tension between Bulgarians and Serbs? No, none whatsoever. Granted, I'm not really covering anything that might bring up some tensions between Serbs and Bulgarians. I'm definitely in places where there are tensions between Serbs and Albanians. And if you saw what happened in the news today, there can still be tensions between Serbs and Croatians or Croats, etc. And I've spent significant amount of time in Bosnia, particularly in Republika Srpska, where there's clear tensions between Serbs and Bosniaks or Bosnian Muslims. So I have seen a lot of ethnic tensions, particularly relating to Serbs in the region, but no, not between Bulgarians and Serbs. And I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but this isn't something that is as evident as tensions between Serbs and other ethnic groups in the region.
Okay, so are there, within Serbia, or some of the, let's say, the Christian parts of the Western Balkans, did you feel any, I don't know what it is, struggle against the idea that the EU is pro, let's say, open borders to Muslims, etc., etc.? Like, are there Serbians who do not want to become part of the EU just because the EU represents immigration?
There's Serbians who don't want to become part of the EU for a variety of reasons. Serbia, if you look at the polls, is more anti-EU than these other countries. And as I was discussing over the weekend in Serbia, there are some fairly clear reasons for this. I mean, go back 19 years at this time, and NATO was bombing Serbia. And if you fast forward to where things stand right now, there are a lot of Serbs who have very fond views of Russia. If you look at the media in Serbia, it paints a very, very pretty picture of Russia and is often very critical of the West. And a lot of that has to do with the West siding with Muslims, but more so siding with Muslims within the Balkan conflicts. Now, regarding to Muslim immigration and the EU basically facilitating that, I would say there's, throughout Eastern Europe, a lot of skepticism about the EU and Muslim integration. And you can see that particularly from the countries that are in the EU. Hungary, how did Hungary react? How did the other Visegrad countries react to Merkel's migrant policy? Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, Bulgaria, for instance. Most countries in the region are fairly against mass immigration, I mean, whether it's Muslim or not, but particularly among the Christian countries in Eastern Europe, yeah, they're quite negative on Muslim immigration.
So, but I mean, my question is, does that come up in the talks? Because right now, as far as I understand from your own podcast, your previous podcast, right now Bulgaria is the head of the EU. It's the presidency for 6 months. It's trying to integrate, in a sense, some of the Western Balkan countries into the EU, or trying to facilitate the process. I know that you mentioned that there is a problem with just the fact that there are border disputes between Kosovo and Serbia. But how much of that translates into this broader picture of countries saying, wait a second, or people within certain countries saying, wait a second, we don't want to become a part of the EU because it will mean more immigration, or it will be less Christianity, or something like this?
Well, I think those sentiments were expressed clearly during the migrant crisis and arguably ongoing. I mean, look at the election of Orban recently. So I think they're really separate issues. You mentioned the border disputes in the Balkans and the migrant crisis and the anti-immigrant and anti-Islam sentiments that exist throughout the region. I really think those are separate issues. And we just discussed a bit about the migrants. I mean, the border issue within the Balkans is arguably, I mean, the border disputes in the Western Balkans is arguably the biggest issue that is holding back these countries from integrating into the EU. So there are two Western Balkan, one's arguably not, Croatia and Slovenia, two former Yugoslav republics that are current members of the EU. And even though they're already members of the EU, they still have an ongoing border dispute. They can't agree on what their border is. And this has turned into an embarrassment for the EU. And the EU has responded to that by saying, all you other countries in the Western Balkans, before we're going to let you join the European Union, you need to resolve all of your own border issues. And as they go about trying to do that, a lot of these ethnic tensions pick back up, and there are fights and spikes in nationalism. The one issue that just recently got resolved was the Kosovo-Montenegro border dispute. And that was very difficult to resolve, and it involved the nationalist opposition party in Kosovo setting off tear gas in the parliament repeatedly and having rather violent protests that resembled riots in the streets of Pristina in order to stop that border deal from going through. So if that's foreshadowing what's to come with the questions over Bosnia and Serbia and Kosovo and where and how all these territorial issues get resolved, then there could be major issues on the way to these countries joining the EU.
I think subconsciously in my mind the whole time I've been comparing Yugoslavia with the EU, and particularly there's this one film called Underground. Some of the viewers will know it for sure. Vasco, I know you know it. It's sort of about, it's like this, I can't think of the right word. It's a metaphor for what happens when you force different countries with different beliefs. Well, here it's not forcing. When you force different countries with different beliefs, here it's not forcing, but it's sort of like bribing different countries with different beliefs into a union, and then it's sort of an artificial union for several years or several decades, and then at a certain point the facade falls back. And this, for some reason, I'm having this metaphor between this analogy between Yugoslavia and the EU. It sort of seems like that to me. It's like you're going to get all these countries, and they're still trying. At the same time, as far as I know, the EU is making it more centralized, more federal, in the sense that they're going to make more decisions for the countries, the separate countries. You have Brexit going on, where England wants to get out. There are other countries who are having similar movements. And at the same time, they're trying to expand the EU while making it more like a slavery issue to be a member.
This actually came up
I don't know how to
yesterday.
say it.
I haven't seen the film, but what you're describing came up yesterday. So yesterday, the European Commission released its progress reports for all these countries that were discussing their progress in terms of how they are moving along with these reforms, need to join the EU. And at the same time, the French president Emmanuel Macron was giving a speech. I think it was in Strasbourg, but I'm not sure. It might have been Brussels. I believe it was in Strasbourg. But anyway, so in his speech, he was discussing the very thing you're saying. Macron right now is trying to have a whole lot of centralization in order to reform the EU. To basically he wants to create a common budget, an economic minister for all these countries. He wants a lot of the fiscal decision making to be handed over from the member states to the central government in Brussels. So he's arguing for all kinds of reforms like that. And one of the things he was saying yesterday is we can't have this expansion until we have our reforms. And the reforms he's arguing for are more centralization. So what you're describing was playing out in live time yesterday during the discussions on enlargement.
Apropos.
I think there are a couple interesting points or questions that were asked. The one about Russia,
I think we answered that question.
yeah, briefly. There is a lot of love for Russia in Serbia. I would say in Serbia as a whole, more so than specifically Belgrade. But at the same time, it's an interesting situation because there aren't that many Serbians who are off studying in Russia or working in Russia or speaking Russian. So it's interesting.
Let's see if there are any more questions from the audience.
What about Macedonia? That's a country that you know a thing or two about.
Well, what's the question?
So yesterday when the EU comes out with this report for how are these Western Balkan countries doing, the big announcement was that Albania and Macedonia are now getting the go-ahead from the European Commission to start membership talks. And
so Greece has something to say about this?
With Macedonia, there are all kinds of things going on, including the name issue. But the big development with Macedonia is that for the first time or the first year since this EU accession process has been going on, the prime minister and the government in Macedonia is someone and something that the European Union is very happy with. They pretty much love the new guy. They really love the new Macedonian Prime Minister, Zoran Zaev, and they really disliked the previous guy, the previous Prime Minister, Nikola Gruevski. And arguably the EU ran out Gruevski and brought in Zaev. So when you and I visited Macedonia a couple years back, the EU was bashing Macedonia. The EU was saying, oh, it's totally corrupt, it's undemocratic, Gruevski needs to step down, there need to be free and fair elections. And now when I visited Macedonia this past week, what I found interesting, I didn't speak to enough people, I didn't spend enough time there, but from my gauge, just from who I spoke to, it doesn't seem to me like that with Zaev in place, the government is any more liked than it was previously. I mean, by Macedonians. I don't think Macedonians as a whole are so much happier with their government now than they were with Gruevski in there. Yet, if you read the EU papers, it's night and day difference. Macedonia went from being this terrible country that is doing everything wrong to suddenly this country that's at least trying to do everything right. And the takeaway for me is it seems like there's a bit of a disconnect between what Brussels thinks of the government in Macedonia and what the Macedonians think about the government in Macedonia. And we'll see what happens in the coming weeks because of this name issue that you discussed.
Macedonia, the Eden of fake news. Well, remember we had a podcast a few months ago about how the EU republicizes the information from Wikipedia, which republicizes it from BBC, which
that was the UN, but yeah, we did do a podcast where we broke down a lot of the reporting on the refugee crisis, specifically demographics, who was coming from where, etc., and we tracked sources going back to as original of a source as we could come up with. Interesting podcast. You can check it out on my YouTube channel. It's called something like The Making of Fake News and Where the Refugees Came From. Something like that. There's another question.
Or less. So Vasco asks, the EU political elite is leading the Union in, the fact that the EU is leading the Union is not a good thing, especially for the Balkan countries. Federalization, it will diffuse the Balkan people. What do you think about that? Let me say one word first. Balkanization. Go ahead.
I've discussed quite a bit about balkanization on previous Western Balkan trips.
Let's go for it.
Well, I was having a very similar discussion with someone in Belgrade yesterday. The EU is already dictating, by and large. It doesn't mean they're getting what they want, but the EU is telling these various governments in the Western Balkans what kind of reforms you need to pass, how you need to change your judiciary, how you need to privatize this country, how you need to change this part of your economy. So even though these countries are not even in the EU yet, they're already getting this whole list of orders, which is basically the entire accession process of what they need to do. So they're basically being governed from Brussels already in the sense that they're getting the orders, but then in reality what's happening on the ground is something totally different because these countries are tending to get pretty autocratic right now, with certain politicians consolidating power and really getting a stranglehold over the governments and the media. So on the one hand, the EU is giving all these orders from Brussels to the Western Balkans, but on the other hand, these countries aren't really following these orders, with the exception of some specific ones. And whereas Brussels is saying, you need to be more democratic, you need to have these strong institutions, you need to have an independent judiciary, you need to have an independent media. I wouldn't say that most of these countries in the Western Balkans are trending that way in reality.
Well, it's sort of like politicians' promises before the election. But my question, aren't those countries still getting EU funds?
They're getting a lot of EU
course,
funds.
Just like when I was in Georgia 2 years ago or so, they are like in the process of being accepted by the European Union.
Well, Georgia's way farther out.
I know, but that's my point. They have sort of like a trade agreement with the EU, and they're getting EU funds even though they're not part of the EU.
Well, the EU is spreading funds all over. The EU spreads funds all over Africa. The EU.
So Right, exactly. So if you have these candidate countries from the Western Balkans,
Yeah.
of course they're getting money, and whether or not they're like actually fulfilling the criteria that the EU is laying out or not, that's really probably not the question. And I don't know, because I mean, if you have to look at it like, should they be creating more democratic institutions or should they be creating dictatorships? Well, look over the years. I mean, in the 1980s, what, you know, we're supposed to be promoting democracy, but since when have we promoted democracy? We've just taken out democratic leaders that don't agree with us, and we put in our own dictators, our own puppet dictators.
Well, that's a great point.
So how is this any different? I mean, it's maybe a smoother process.
Well, what you're describing right now is what a lot of people are saying is exactly what's happening in the Western Balkans. So you have Milo Djukanovic, who just got reelected technically elected president in Montenegro. That's where I was on Sunday covering the election. Milo Djukanovic rose to power in Montenegro in 1991. In 2018, he is still in power in Montenegro. However, over the course of that span, he's gone from being a communist and Milosevic ally to being someone who's so ardently pro-West that he led his country into NATO. And what the critics are saying is that in exchange for loyalty from these leaders, in exchange for loyalty on this Western path, the EU and NATO and the US are allowing certain autocrats or leaders in the Western Balkans to get away with all kinds of democratic abuses.
Makes sense to me. Vasco, you said that you were wondering about the cultural way in which the EU is not leading the Union in a good way. I don't understand that question, actually. Is it good culturally? From my point of view, I think he's asking about globalization and sort of like keeping the natural charms of countries. No?
No, we're getting feedback from Vasco in live time.
The way to federalization.
The way is to federal, and this way. We discussed federalization earlier.
Okay, I think it's probably time we wrap it up, actually. So, Josh, from your latest trip, where would you sit? What sort of predictions could you make about the next 5 to 10 years within the European Union? Are there going to be changes, additions, subtractions?
Well, according to the EU's own target dates, there will be no additions in the next 5 years. Okay. They are striving for both Montenegro and Serbia to join in 2025. I believe it is more realistic for Montenegro to join by then than Serbia, and I'm not saying that's because Montenegro is a more democratic country than Serbia. I believe that Montenegro has fewer geopolitical obstacles in its way to joining the EU than Serbia. I really don't know how the Kosovo question is going to get resolved. In order for Serbia to join the EU, it's going to have to come to some binding deal on normalization of relations, as the EU says. Maybe that means Serbia is going to have to outright recognize Kosovo. Maybe not. I've discussed this in my reporting, and there's going to be publishing more interviews that I've done on this topic that I just did last week in Belgrade. It's going to be something that people are debating and hashing out over the coming years. Montenegro has clear democratic deficits, but as we discussed, it is clearly on the Western course. It is already in NATO, which has been a stepping stone for Eastern European countries to joining the EU. And its leadership is basically got some sort of deal going on with the EU, and I think the EU, for its own credibility's sake, as it's losing the UK, is going to want to expand. So I would say Montenegro has a pretty good shot to get into the European Union several years out. But a lot of things could happen in the meanwhile.
Final question. Is it a good thing for the EU to expand?
What's your answer to that?
Is it going to lead to more chaos, or is it going to lead to more order?
I do think that if some of these countries in the Western Balkans take some of these issues seriously of trying to establish working institutions so that you have rule of law as opposed to rule of man, that could be a very productive thing. In general, I think it's better to have rule of law than rule of man. And at least on the surface, the EU is pushing for that in the Western Balkans. In reality, it doesn't so much seem like that's coming into being.
We fight war for democracy. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Brent. Are you going to end this broadcast?
Thank you all for paying attention.
You're the master of ceremonies. You get to press the end live video.
Thank you all for following in on us. I know it's been a little bit here and there, but hopefully you learned something. Ciao. Josh?
Ciao.
Ciao.
Like a venture.
Is that it?